Ah yes, the age-old question, to heal, to tank, or to deal damage. Some people may want to play all three roles equally, or some, such as myself, may want to specialize in one role. Everyone has to start somewhere though, and I always see people talk about which class is right for you, but I don't often see people talking about which role may be right for you. So my name's Doc, and despite me being the healer guy, I am going to do my best to answer the question of which role might be for you. Whether you're a brand new player or a veteran looking to try something new, I think this video has something for everyone. So let's talk about it. As much as it might surprise you, I'm actually not going to talk about the healers first. The first role I'm going to talk about is the most popular role, that being the damage dealer, sometimes referred to as DPS. If tanks and healers are your bread and butter, then these guys are whatever's in the middle of your favorite sandwich. And now that I've made us all hungry, let's talk about what's expected of our DPS friends. Your main role as a damage dealer is to, well, deal damage. Of course though, that's not all that they do. On top of slaying out, DPS are also typically the ones doing most of the mechanics and trials, focusing on burning down key targets and reviving fallen players. Despite how much I tease my DPS people out there, you guys actually have a pretty complex role, and it's definitely the most varied role in terms of where you can go and what you can do with your build. I think that flexibility and variety is probably the best thing about being a DPS. You need to do some questing, dungeons, arenas, trials. You probably don't have to change too terribly much about your build to move from content to content, unlike tanks and healers. Of course, I've got to mention that DPS is the most popular role for a reason. A lot of people find it really fun. I mean, I get it. There's something really satisfying about parsing crazy high and watching a boss's health bar melt. Even beyond just finding it fun, it's very new player friendly. Sure, maybe you won't be doing crazy high damage right from the start, but it's pretty easy to slap on some damage skills and contribute to your team. Of course though, I do need to talk about some of the downsides as well. The first and absolutely the most prevalent is how popular the role is. This means that queue times for dungeons can be long, like very long. I don't know exactly how long they are on average at the time of posting this video, but I've talked to people who say it's usually at least a few minutes and sometimes it can get pretty high during non-peak hours. Of course though, the nice thing about being a DPS is that you can still very easily do other things while you're waiting in queue, but I know some people have made the swap to tank or healer purely to escape the long queue times. Another not so awesome thing to note about playing DPS is that it's pretty noticeable when a DPS is underperforming. In the heat of battle, you might not always notice a huge difference between a mediocre healer and a great healer, or a mediocre tank and a great tank. You get a couple bad DPS on your team, it's extremely noticeable. And I've seen some people vent their frustrations at being called out in the middle of a dungeon or a trial. Honestly though, outside of those couple things, there aren't too many downsides to playing DPS. If you enjoy slaying out, being viable in a large amount of content, and can deal with some long queue times, then DPS might be for you. Up next, we're going to talk about tanks. What, you thought that I wouldn't save healers for last? No. Right now, we're going to talk about the moms and dads of every friend group, the tanks. Real quick though, please don't crash out on me in the comments about the build and the gameplay. This is just a hybrid tank healer build I like to use every now and then, like if a tank leaves in the middle of a dungeon or something. So your main role as a tank is to keep enemies taunted so they don't attack the rest of the group. Like with our DPS, tanks have a lot more going on than just that. They're also applying debuffs to enemies, keeping key targets in good positions, initiating encounters, and quite a bit more, to be completely honest with you. Right out the gate, the nicest thing about being a tank is that tanks are always in demand. There are never enough tanks. It is the least played role by a pretty decent margin, and tanks are needed for pretty much every piece of group content in the entire game. When it comes to dungeons, tank queue times are going to be insanely short. Partially due to that demand, but also partially due to the complexity of the role. I'd argue that tanks are the real heroes of the game, to be honest with you. And this is coming from a healer, so, don't let that inflate your egos too much, tanks, but you guys are pretty cool. A good tank can take care of the group. A great tank can hard carry an entire raid team. Since I mentioned it a second ago, I'll talk about the complexity of the role. This can be seen as a pro or a con, but I tend to think it's more of a pro. Tanks have arguably the most difficult role in most content, and while it may seem like all they're doing is standing there and blocking, I promise there's so much more going on. It makes the role feel incredibly rewarding to play. Tanks have a pretty high skill ceiling, but they have an even higher knowledge ceiling. Some of the best tanks I've ever met could tell you pretty much everything about an encounter. Mechanics, boss health stages, hidden mechanics that people would normally miss, everything. Like with DPS though, I'm going to talk about some of the not so awesome things about being a tank. The first is that it can be pretty difficult to get into. I did say that I consider the complexity of the role to be mostly a pro. However, that same complexity can make it difficult for a new player or even a veteran player to get into tanking. In the same vein, tanks also have a lot of pressure on their shoulders. If a DPS dies, all that happens is damage slows down. If a healer goes down, that's bad, but usually recoverable. When a tank goes down, most of the time, the group's gonna wipe. This means that being a bad tank doesn't just slow down the completion of content, it can literally mean not being able to complete the content in some cases. Overall though, despite the few drawbacks, being a tank is a very rewarding and demanding experience. If you like protecting your team, being needed, taking fights head on, and you're not afraid of a little pressure, then this is the role for you. And last, but certainly not least, we have the best role, my fellow healers. My favorite role to play, not just in this game, but every game really, and the role that is the foundation of my channel. So I feel pretty qualified to talk about this. Of course, I have plenty of other videos on the channel talking about healing if you want a more in-depth explanation, but let's start with exactly what healers do. The role of the healer is to heal. Yep, that's it. Nothing else. I'm just kidding. Healers, like the other roles, have a lot more going on than what appears on the surface. On top of healing, we're also applying buffs to our teammates, helping our teammates manage their resources, interacting with mechanics like kite healing and heal checks, and much more. Much like tanks, healers are a pretty in-demand role. Not quite as in-demand as tanks, but healers still enjoy a very short queue time for dungeons. Healers are also a pretty new player-friendly role, to be honest with you. It's very easy to just roll a new character, slap on a couple of heal over time spells, and get plenty of value. Of course, much like the other roles, one thing I really love about healing in ESO is that it can take a lot of time and skill to master. You've got a skill rotation just like the DPS, but it's also very dynamic because you may need to burst heal a low teammate, reapply a buff at a key time when the team needs it most, prepare for a heal check, all sorts of things. Being able to manage close to 100% uptimes on your buffs requires a lot of time and practice of the healing role, and I can really appreciate that healing in ESO can appeal to both brand new players and grizzled veterans alike. Like our other roles, I do need to talk about some of the downsides. The biggest is that healers are unfortunately not always needed. In a lot of 4-man content like dungeons, some self-heals and a good tank is usually enough to keep your team alive. Of course, that's not to say that the vast majority of people don't appreciate having a healer, but just to say be prepared to run a hybrid build or even a full DPS build if you're planning on trying to get some dungeon trifectas. Another thing some people have talked about for healers is that our metas don't really change very often. Wardens have been the best healing class since they released all the way back in 2017 with the Morrowind expansion, and the Trials healer gear and loadout and skill and all that setup hasn't really changed a whole lot since 2022 when High Isle released. If you're new to healing, that probably won't really matter to you, but I figured I'd just let you know that if you're someone who enjoys constantly changing metas, then healing may not be quite as enjoyable of a role for you. I'm sure it's pretty obvious, though, that despite the couple of negatives, I absolutely adore healing in this game. And you're welcome to check out the rest of my channel if you're wanting to give it a try, because I've got plenty of great guides and tips and other things on there. And I think that pretty much covers it. I'm sure there's probably more that I could talk about, but I didn't want to make this video super long. As always, though, I hope you enjoyed the video and found it useful. Let me know in the comments what your main role is, and Maybe if you've been thinking about trying something new. Other than that, don't forget to subscribe and check out the link below to follow me on stuff so you don't miss a video or a stream. And finally, I think all I've got left to say is that I've been Doc. Take care of yourselves, be good to others, don't forget to thank your tanks, and I will catch y'all in the next one.